He sheltered 4 abandoned kids. The next day, the settlers surrounded his house. The wind that morning was the kind that carried ghosts with it. It moved over the pines like a hymn, brushing snow from the branches and sending flurries down onto the worn roof of a log cabin that sat hunched and alone near the foot of Black Elk Ridge. Smoke curled from its chimney like a tired breath, and inside Elijah Brogan stirred awake, not by choice, but by instinct, the way a deer senses danger before it can name it. His bones protested as he swung his legs over the side of the cot. The fire had gone low during the night, leaving only embers and a fading orange memory. He wrapped himself in his long coat, wool patched, too warm for pride, and opened the door. What he saw wasn't danger, not in the way a man expects. It was 4 shapes, small and frozen, huddled beneath his broken wagon like a litter of pups trying to disappear into the snow. One of them, the biggest, a girl, maybe 10, was holding something swaddled to her chest. The smallest stirred and whimpered, and the sound cut through the morning air like a prayer forgotten too long. He didn't speak. He stepped back inside and put more wood on the fire. His hands moved without thought, kettle on the hook, coffee ground scooped, pan greased for cornbread. Outside, the wind shifted again. A crow called once from the tree above the wagon, and then was silent. Only when the fire cracked loud enough to wake Stone did he step back out. The girl didn't flinch when he approached. The others, a boy of about 8, another maybe 6, watched with eyes so wide and glassy they looked near feral. He knelt down, letting his knees sink into the snow, and met the girl's gaze. "You come far?" he asked, voice like gravel on old leather. She blinked but didn't answer. He reached for the baby she cradled, careful and slow, but she tightened her arms and turned slightly. A silent answer, if ever there was one. "All right," he murmured, standing. "All right." Inside, the warmth hit them like a wave. The baby cried as soon as the door shut, loud and shrill, the kind of cry that carried hunger and cold and something deeper, a memory of being left. He fed them what he had. Biscuits, a bit of jerky torn into bits too tough for teeth that young, milk, warmed to a temperature he hoped was right. They ate in silence, except the baby, who fussed and whimpered, and finally fell asleep in a basket padded with a quilt Elijah hadn't looked at in years. He didn't ask their names, didn't ask where they came from or who left them. Questions were for men who needed answers to act decent. Elijah just made sure their boots came off and their toes were pink again before he laid them near the fire and draped extra wool over their shoulders. Outside, the wind picked up, dragging clouds across the sky like a herd of buffalo moving, slow but certain. Snow fell again by late afternoon, and the trees groaned under the weight of it. The girl watched him with the eyes of someone who'd grown up too fast. She said nothing, but her shoulders eased when he stirred more broth into the pot. The boy with the dirt-smudged cheeks followed Elijah as he chopped wood. The smallest sat by the fire and stared at the flame like it might answer something. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He sat by the window, rifle across his lap, more for habit than fear, and stared out into the trees, wondering what kind of parent leaves 4 children in the snow, wondering what kind of man he'd become, that fate would deliver them to him. There'd been a time when he and Sarah had talked of children. They'd planned for it in quiet tones, planting apple trees and quilting extra bedsheets. But that time had passed like a train in the distance, loud, sudden, gone before he could wave. The fire had taken the house. The fever had taken Sarah 2 winters later. What remained was this cabin, this silence, and the ache that crept into his hands whenever he stood still too long. The baby stirred in her sleep and let out a small cough. Elijah looked over, slow and unsure, like a man approaching a snake. Her tiny fingers reached out and found nothing, so he rose, crossed the floor and let her hold his pinky. Her hand was so small it hardly fit around the knuckle, but she held on tight, like he was a mast in some storm. He stood there for a long time, unmoving. The girl opened one eye, saw him, then closed it again. Not out of trust, just fatigue, maybe. But she didn't stir. When the sun rose, grey and heavy, the cabin smelled of oats and ash. Elijah cooked while the children woke slow, blinking like newborn foals. They didn't speak, but they didn't cry either. Mid-morning, he found an old shawl in the trunk near his cot and wrapped it around the girl's shoulders. She pulled it tight and gave the faintest nod, one of those gestures that carried the weight of a thank you louder than any word could. The second boy, he must have been Micah's age, kept staring at the mounted elk head above the hearth. Elijah watched his eyes trace the antlers, his fingers twitching like he might someday carve such a thing himself. Elijah thought of asking if he liked to draw, but held his tongue. Let quiet be their common tongue for now. He went out to chop more wood after breakfast. The girl followed, not to help, but just to watch. Her breath clouded in front of her, like a spirit she couldn't shake. He let her stand there as he worked, the steady rhythm of the axe splitting log after log, the sound like a heartbeat trying to be steady. She spoke once, soft, barely there. "Will they come looking?" Elijah paused, wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. Might not. She looked down. "If they do, are you going to give us back?" The axe hovered mid-air for a second, then dropped into the log with a dull thunk. He didn't answer, just set another log on the stump. That evening, as the sky turned the color of bruised plums and snow dusted everything again, Elijah stepped outside and lit the lantern. It glowed soft and amber in the dark, a signal to no one and everyone. Back inside, the children were curled up together under the thick quilts. The baby's chest rose and fell like a leaf in shallow water. Elijah stoked the fire, sat back down in the chair he'd built himself 20 years ago, and pulled a book from the shelf. He read aloud, not loud, not for them, maybe just for himself. The words filled the room, ancient stories of stars and beasts and travelers lost in the woods. They listened, though, he could tell, eyes half closed but ears open, hearts open. Before he slept, though the word felt too generous, he looked at them one last time, their breath in sync, the smallest's hand holding the girl's. He let himself feel something then, not joy, not grief, something quieter, a presence. In the stillness he murmured under his breath, "Ain't no storm I ain't seen, but this one's different." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind shifted again, and the trees for a moment stood very still. The snow had not yet melted from Elijah's shoulders when he walked into Bell's general store. The Sioux. Bell above the door gave a reluctant jingle, like even it wasn't sure what to make of him these days. His boots left dark, wet marks across the floorboards. He didn't look up, just went to the shelves, picked up a canister of powdered milk, a bundle of wool, and a jar of honey, like a man gathering a riddle he wasn't ready to explain. Martha. Belle was behind the counter as she always was. Sleeves rolled past her elbows, silver hair coiled in a bun, as tight as her judgments. She didn't speak at first, just watched him set the items down, one after the other, as if each told a story, and she was trying to guess the ending. "Milk, wool, and honey," she finally said, her voice low and clipped. "A curious meal." Elijah didn't answer. He kept his gaze on the countertop, worn smooth by decades of hands, both desperate and casual. She folded her arms. "You're feeding someone." Silence. Her eyes narrowed. "You don't eat honey, Elijah." He looked up then, only just. "That a crime? It is when folks are asking questions I don't have answers for." She leaned in. "4 mouths, I heard, all small." He didn't flinch, but the pause before he reached for his coin purse was long enough to answer. "Her." She said nothing else, only rang up the sail and handed over the bag with the same sternness one might give a shovel at a shallow grave. Outside, the cold had teeth again. Wind wound its way through the alley between the mercantile and the blacksmiths, dragging stray voices with it. Elijah walked with his collar up, eyes on the snowy ground. He heard the whispers before the door shut behind him. "4? Where from?" "Just showed up, I reckon. Ain't right. Man's not fit. Poor things ought to be with proper folks." He kept walking, steady and unhurried, but the words clung to him like sleet. The world had a way of weighing down the already bent. By the time he returned to his cabin, the girl had the baby bundled against her chest, and the boys were trying to tie string around 2 sticks like it might make a toy. They looked up when he came through the door, their eyes bright and unsure, the way deer look at a hunter who hasn't lifted his rifle yet. He handed the bag to the girl. She took it carefully, like it might vanish if she blinked too long. Later, that day, as the snow settled into quiet drifts and the world turned still again, a rider approached. Elijah saw him before the horse crested the final rise, a dark figure against the pale, moving slow, not urgent, but deliberate. He didn't reach for his rifle, but he didn't sit either. The rider was Sheriff Tom Daly. Tom looked older than the last time Elijah had seen him, more grey in the beard, more weight behind the eyes. They had once been friends years ago, when friendship came easier and the world felt simpler. Before the fire, before the grave, before Elijah had chosen silence as his only company. Tom dismounted, tied his reins to the fence post, and stood there a moment, squinting against the wind. "You got a minute?" he asked. Elijah nodded, opened the door, and let him in. The children went still. The baby let out a soft cry that was quickly hushed by the girl's gentle rocking. Tom's eyes fell on them, one by one. He didn't speak for a long breath. Then he rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable. "So it's true," he said. "You're keeping 'em. They ain't stray dogs, Tom. I know what they ain't. What I'm trying to figure is what they are to you." Elijah stirred the kettle on the stove. "Cold, hungry, afraid. You don't know where they come from. I don't need to." Tom stepped closer, voice lower. "You take 'em in. You make it your business. Folks are talking, Eli. Loud. They want answers." Elijah turned to him, eyes dark, voice flat. "Since when does kindness require permission?" Tom's jaw clenched. "You know that ain't what I mean. This ain't just some story of a good man doing a good thing. These kids, they got no names, no papers, no people. That makes 'em a problem. And you ain't exactly known for sound judgment lately." The girl stood up, slow but sure. "We don't want trouble." Tom looked at her, startled by the words. The other children clung to her skirt like they knew the room had shifted. "No one's looking to hurt." "You little miss," Tom said softly. She didn't blink. "We're not going back." Tom looked at Elijah again, something unreadable in his eyes. "You sure about this?" Elijah's hands tightened around the edge of the stove. "They're here. I feed them. I protect them. That's what I'm sure of." The fire cracked behind them. Tom exhaled through his nose, then nodded once and stepped back toward the door. "I'll give it time, but don't expect the town to be as patient." Outside, the wind had quieted, but the air was colder. Tom's horse whinnied as he mounted. "Again? Hell of a thing you're doing," he said, almost too quiet to hear. "Hope you can carry it." Elijah didn't answer, just watched as the sheriff rode off, his figure swallowed slowly by the trees. That evening the boys laughed for the first time. It was soft and fleeting, sparked by some clumsy stumble that sent one of them into a pile of old quilts. The sound startled Elijah. It had been so long since laughter lived under that roof. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Not yet. After they went to sleep, he sat outside on the steps with his coat drawn tight and his rifle across his knees. The bare stars were out, brittle and blinking. The moon hung like a judge. He thought about Tom, about the town, about the way people like things tidy, stories with beginnings, middles, and ends, not mysteries wrapped in wool and asking for food. He remembered the way Sarah used to bake too much bread, just in case. Someone came hungry. She'd hated the idea of hunger, thought it was the ugliest thing in the world. That memory hurt like a splinter too deep to pull. The next morning, he found the note. It was nailed to his door with a rusted horseshoe nail, crooked and cruel. "They're not yours. We'll come for them." There was no signature, just the cold black scrawl of someone convinced of their own righteousness. He pulled it down slowly, read it twice, then folded it once and tucked it into his coat pocket. He didn't tell the children, just went about the morning as he had. The day before, boiling oats, layering firewood, tightening the gaps in the window frames against the wind. But when the baby cried and reached for him, he picked her up without hesitation, held her close until she calmed, her tiny breath warming his neck. Outside, the wind was blowing again. Inside, Elijah made the fire just a little higher. The morning came brittle and grey, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to breathe. Frost rimmed the windows in lace patterns, delicate and sharp. Elijah rose early, not because he wanted to, but because the world didn't give him reason to linger in sleep anymore. He stirred the fire with half-lidded eyes, fed it slow-burning logs, and listened to the cabin creak like an old memory shifting its weight. The children were still asleep, bundled under quilts like seeds waiting for spring. The girl, always the first to wake, stirred with the sound of the kettle and sat up, shoulders squared before her eyes even opened fully. She stretched her legs, then padded across the floor in bare feet to check the baby in the basket near the hearth. Her fingers were sure and practiced. The baby barely whimpered, soothed by her presence alone. Elijah watched from his place by the stove. He didn't speak. He'd learned the girl didn't like questions first thing in the morning. She moved with the certainty of someone who'd raised more siblings than she'd had birthdays. She glanced at him once, as she pulled the kettle from the heat and poured water into the dented tin mugs. He nodded, wordless thanks. She handed him his with steady hands. Their eyes met for a breath longer than they had yesterday. Later the boys woke. Micah, the middle one, yawned like a bear cub and went straight to the window, drawing faces in. The frost. Reuben, smaller, quieter, huddled near the fire and began to stack small twigs like he was building a shrine. Elijah cooked oatmeal and passed around slices of cold cornbread. No one complained. There was a reverence to eating in silence, like survival, honored. After breakfast, the girl took the baby and wrapped her tight in a quilt, then walked out, onto the porch without asking permission. Elijah followed, if only to be near. She sat on the top step, letting the baby rest in her arms, while her eyes traced the tree line. He lowered himself to the far end of the porch. Snow whispered down from the limbs above. The woods were quiet, but not dead. A jay called somewhere far off. The sound echoed strange in the stillness. "You said they might come," she said, not looking at him. Elijah gave a slow nod. "That's right." She adjusted the blanket around the baby's chin. "What'll you do?" "Depends on how they come." A long pause followed. The girl looked at him then. Her eyes were dark, ancient with knowing. "My mama ran. He hit her a lot. Said we was punishment from God." He didn't flinch. Just listened. She waited till he was gone. Took us into the woods with nothing but what we could carry. We got lost for a while. Then she left us with a note on a tree. A beat passed. She never came back. The words dropped into the cold like stones in water. Elijah didn't move, didn't speak, but something in his chest twisted, slow and deep. "She tried," he said finally. "Some folks break in the trying." The girl nodded, but her jaw was tight. "I don't think she meant to go." I think someone made sure she didn't come back." Elijah didn't ask more. He knew the shape of grief that came with too few answers and too many shadows. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small folding knife, and opened it. Then, gently, he passed it across the space between them. The girl looked at it warily. "Not for fightin', for whittlin'. You ever carved?" She shook her head. He stood slowly and went to the woodpile, chose a piece of pine no thicker than his thumb, and brought it back. Kneeling beside her, he showed how to brace it, how to angle the blade, how to guide the hand slow, not forceful. She watched close, then took the knife and tried. Her first cut was crooked, her second better. On the third, a tiny curl of wood fell to the porch. "Good," he said. The baby shifted in her arms, fussed a little, then settled again. Elijah returned to his end of the step and sat back. For a time, the only sounds were the blade against wood and the hush of snow in the trees. Later, when the sky had turned a little less grey and the wind softened, he went inside. The boys were making noise, small, joyful chaos. Micah had found a lump of charcoal and was drawing strange figures on the hearthstone. Reuben watched him like the world depended on every line. "Draw in what?" Elijah asked, voice low. Micah shrugged. "People, us, maybe, or stories." Elijah nodded. "That's good. Can I draw a bear?" "You can draw a bear," he said, and the boy grinned. That afternoon someone knocked. Not loud, not urgent, but sudden. Elijah opened the door with his rifle resting against the frame. It was Martha Bell. She stood there in her coat, cheeks red from wind, arms full of a brown-wrapped bundle. He stepped aside, unsure. She didn't ask for an invitation, just walked in, set the bundle on the table, and peeled back the paper to reveal a loaf of bread, 2 bars of soap, and a small jar of lard. "You don't have to talk to get the message across," she said. "This ain't charity, it's sense." He nodded. "Thank you." Her eyes scanned the room, saw the charcoal drawings, the girl by the fire now, carving with focused intensity, the baby on a quilt, gumming a wooden spoon. "They'll hang you for kidnapping if someone gets riled enough," she said flatly. "They're not kidnapped," he replied. "That's not always the point," she muttered. There was a quiet between them then, old, tired, complicated. Once she'd been a friend to Sarah. They'd sung together in church, when that still meant something. She'd wept at the burial. Then disappeared like most folks do when sorrow lingers too long to be polite. Elijah poured her tea. She took it without thanks. He spoke after a long silence. "You ever think about why people care more about how things look than how they are?" She blew on the tea. "Because it's easier. You can fix appearances with gossip. Truth takes work." She stood after one long sip and moved toward the door. As she left, she paused. "I'll bring eggs tomorrow." He nodded again. That night, Elijah found the boy, Reuben, still sitting up, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the fire. "You all right?" he asked. The boy didn't speak, but reached out and touched Elijah's hand. It was the first touch he'd offered. It lasted only a moment, but it stayed with Elijah longer than most conversations. Later, he tucked the children in. The girl now slept with the knife under her pillow, her curls loose around her face like a halo fallen sideways. Micah mumbled, in his sleep. Reuben curled against the baby like a shield. Outside, Elijah walked the porch, lantern in hand. He checked the snow, the fence, the tracks. He saw nothing, heard only the wind. And then he looked up. Across the field, just at the edge of the tree line, a flicker of movement, a glint perhaps, the shape of someone watching, still, waiting. He held his breath. Then the figure moved, slowly, back into the trees, gone. He stood there a long time, staring. Then he went back inside, locked the door, and fed the fire a few more logs. Tomorrow he would sharpen the tools, lay out more blankets, find something else to teach. Tonight he sat by the window and listened, not for threats, but for breathing, for trust, and for the silence that had finally somehow begun to feel like company. The snow crunched beneath the weight of boots, too deliberate to belong to a traveler passing through. Elijah knew that sound. He stood by the window, eyes narrowed, watching as figures emerged slowly from the edge of the trees. 6 men, maybe. More, coming up the slope like a slow tide. No urgency in their pace, but every step meant business. One of them carried a lantern, another a shotgun slung carelessly against his shoulder. Their breath steamed into the brittle air, rising like smoke from a fire that had yet to start. He didn't say a word to the children, just turned from the window, grabbed his coat and stepped onto the porch. The cold bit harder than usual, or maybe it was just the heat building in his chest. Behind him, the girl appeared silently, holding the baby close. Her eyes were hard. Josie, he had begun to call her in his thoughts, though he still hadn't asked. Naming things made them permanent. He wasn't sure what that meant for a man like him. The townsman stopped about 20 feet out, not too close, but close enough to be seen. Elijah scanned their faces. He recognized all of them. Neighbors, once. Men who'd shared whiskey, fence posts, and tired talk in his past life. But now they looked at him like he was something they needed to put down before it got out of hand. Sheriff Tom Daly stepped forward, one hand resting on his belt. "Elijah," he called, voice low and clear, "you know why we're here." Elijah didn't answer, just stood there, breathing slow, arms at his sides. Tom tried again. "We can't let this go on. It's not just about you. It's about the law. About what happens when folks start taking in kids without word, without order." "They didn't come with order," Elijah said flatly. "They came with frostbite." Tom's jaw tensed. The lantern light flickered across his face. "That ain't the point. It's exactly the point," Elijah said. "You want rules more than you want right." A murmur stirred in the group. One of the men, Harlan Price, stepped forward, hands in his coat pockets, mouth twisted like he'd swallowed vinegar. "This ain't personal, Eli," Harlan said, "but people are talking. You ain't the man to raise no children. Hell, you couldn't even keep your own family whole." Elijah's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes went still. Josie's voice broke the silence. "We ain't going." Every man turned. Her words were small, but they cut sharp. She stood straight, chin high, even as the baby whimpered against her chest. "You can't take us," she said. "You ain't got the right." Tom looked pained. "Child, I know you're scared, but this ain't about punishment, it's about safety." "Then why'd you bring gun?" she asked. None of them answered. Behind the girl, the boys peered out from the window. Micah's hand clutched the curtain. Reuben stood so still he looked carved from wood. Inside the cabin, the firelight cast their faces in soft amber, as if the place itself wanted to shield them from the cold outside. Martha Bell walked up the slope alone, without invitation, without warning. She came from the opposite path, carrying nothing, her face unreadable. She stopped between Elijah and the group, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "I didn't come to pick a side," she said, looking first at Tom, then at Harlan. "But I've seen those children, and I've seen what kindness looks like when it costs something." Harlan spat into the snow. "This ain't kindness, it's recklessness. He's broken." "Then maybe broken people are the only ones who know how to hold others careful," she snapped. "You got love in your house, Harlan? You got tenderness in your spine?" Tom raised a hand to quiet them, but the group was already splintering. Elijah saw it. The way the men shifted. Uncertain now, one of them lowered his rifle without realizing. Another took a step back. "I ain't letting this turn into a fight," Tom said firmly. "It already is," Elijah replied. "It's just quiet." Tom's eyes darkened. "I'm the law here, Eli. Don't make me do what I don't want to." Elijah stepped off the porch. The wind tugged at his coat, pulled his words out slow. I got no claim to them, no papers, no preacher's blessing. But they came to me cold, hungry, scared. You think I'm going to hand them back to whatever did that to them? The girl's voice came again, softer now. He sings to the baby when she won't sleep. Elijah froze. So did the men. He don't talk much, she said, but he listens. He don't touch us when we flinch. He waits till we're ready. She swallowed hard. I ain't never had that before. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that made men face themselves. Tom took off his hat and rubbed his face like he was trying to wake from something. Damn it, Eli. Elijah looked at him. You want to take them, Tom. You'll have to kill me. That's plain. Tom looked like he might say more, but then he just nodded, slow and heavy, like a man laying down a burden he didn't want to carry any more. I ain't here to spill blood, he said. Not today. He turned, motioned to the others. Go home. They didn't move right away. But one by one, like leaves giving in to gravity, they turned and walked back into the trees. Harlan lingered last, lips pursed tight, but even he couldn't find a word sharp enough to hold weight, so he followed. Tom lingered. You're gonna have to answer for this one day, he said, almost gently. I already do, Elijah replied. Tom nodded again and left without another word. Martha stayed. She looked at Elijah, then at the girl. You got names? The girl hesitated, then nodded. Josie, that's Micah and Reuben. The baby's Ruth. Martha looked to Elijah. That your choosing? I figured they deserved names someone would say soft. The old woman's eyes glistened. She didn't let it fall into tears, just touched the baby's forehead gently, then turned to go. The girl stood on the porch even after the lantern light had disappeared down the slope. She looked up at Elijah, her eyes searching for something, fear maybe, or guilt, or doubt. But what she found finally was just him, steady as the post he leaned on, breath rising slow in the cold. You really weren't gonna let them take us, she said. No, he answered. She sat beside him, the baby still nestled against her chest, and leaned just slightly until their shoulders touched. For a long time they said nothing, but trust had its own language, and for once they both knew how to speak it. The days that followed came quiet and steady, like a thaw after a long freeze. The snow still clung to the trees, but the wind softened its bite, and even the sun seemed to linger longer on the ridge before dipping west. Inside the cabin, the air grew warmer, not just from the fire, but from something slower and more sacred taking root. A rhythm had formed, not perfect, not painless, but real. Josie no longer waited for Elijah's nod before feeding the baby. She just did it. Micah started helping stack wood without being asked, his small hands trying to match Elijah's in speed and form. Reuben had begun to hum, tuneless, soft under his breath, while he built small things with pine scraps, a horse, a wagon, a crooked house with no doors. Elijah noticed he always carved a little chimney, always let the smoke curl in his imagination. Every night Elijah read aloud, voice gruff and uneven but persistent. Josie would sit nearest the fire, baby Ruth sleeping against her ribs, and the boys would crowd close enough to feel safe, but not suffocated. It became a ritual, one that neither words nor law could dictate. On the third evening since the standoff, Martha returned. She didn't knock, didn't wait, just walked in with a sack of potatoes and a tin of flour, her shawl dusted in frost. She nodded to Elijah, dropped the goods on the table, and began peeling apples like she'd always belonged in that kitchen. No one questioned it. She cooked. That night, a stew with sage and meat Elijah didn't ask the source of. Her hands were brisk, her words few, but her presence turned the room into something warmer than fire alone could manage. When the children had gone to sleep, Martha and Elijah sat in the quiet. She handed him a tin cup of tea, strong and bitter. I heard some folks down at the mill say you should run, she said, without looking at him. He took a slow sip. And what did you say? I said maybe they ought to run from themselves first. He let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Brave thing to say. I buried 2 husbands, Elijah. There ain't much left to scare me. He glanced. Over, watching her in the firelight, the years had carved her sharper but not smaller. She was flint, not ash. She looked up at him then, and for a second there was something soft in her gaze, not romantic, not yet, but tender, knowing, shared. You were always a good man, she said, even when you stopped thinking so. That night, Elijah lay awake longer than usual. The fire burned low, but he didn't stoke it. He watched the light flicker on the ceiling beams, listening to the breaths of children who had once flinched. At every sound, he thought of Josie's eyes, the way they no longer scanned for exits. He thought of Reuben's carved chimney, of Micah's crooked drawings, of baby Ruth's fingers curling around his thumb. He thought of how love, when quiet and consistent, could do more than heal. It could rebuild. The next morning came hard, not with weather, but with fire. It began at the tree line. Elijah caught the scent of smoke before he saw it, sharp and angry, carried fast by a wind that hadn't howled in days. He ran out to the porch and saw the orange tongue rising against the snow, licking the branches like it wanted the world. Someone had set it. There was no mistaking that. "Josie!" he barked, already hauling the water barrels toward the cabin's edge. "Get the boys out the back, down to the creek." She obeyed without pause, scooping Reuben under one arm, Micah with the other, calling for them to run fast and not look back. Martha helped gather the bundles. Baby Ruth pressed to her chest like a heartbeat. Elijah turned back toward the fire, eyes narrowing. It wasn't just a blaze, it was a message. It was the town's whisper turned to flame, a coward's vengeance. For dignity unshaken, he grabbed the shovel, broke snow loose from the path, and began flinging it toward the encroaching heat. It hissed and spat but did little. The fire crept closer. He ran to the side shed, tore open the door, and hauled out the spare rain barrels, half frozen but usable. He dumped what he could along the perimeter, soaking the logs, soaking himself, arms burning from the effort. Behind him, the cabin pulsed. With heat, inside was every trace of what they had built, the drawings on the wall, the carvings, the books, the quilts. He wouldn't let it go. Martha reappeared at his side, wild-eyed but unflinching. "Children are safe," she said. "But you stay out here any longer, you won't be." He shook his head. "Can't let it spread. If it hits the roof, then we build another damn roof." He stopped, looked at her, really looked, then nodded once and let her pull him away. The fire didn't take the cabin. It scorched the eastern fence line, devoured the woodpile, blackened the shed. But the snow and the frantic hands held the flames just enough. By dusk it was smoke and cinders and frozen earth again. Elijah stood in the ash with blistered hands and a burned sleeve. Josie returned, baby Ruth strapped to her chest, eyes wide but dry. Micah clung to her side. Reuben walked straight to Elijah and wrapped both arms around his waist without a word. Martha approached with bandages and a jug of water. "They meant to burn you out," she said. "Meant to scare you gone." "They failed," he said simply. That night they didn't sleep in the cabin. The smoke was too heavy, the roof too uncertain. Instead, they camped in the snow near the creek, under blankets and tarps, the fire a small circle of safety. Josie curled close beside Elijah, the baby sleeping between them. Martha sat across, rubbing balm into his cracked knuckles. "I'll fix the fence tomorrow," he muttered, half asleep. "We'll fix it," Martha replied, and somehow that made it feel possible. The stars came out, scattered and cold, but the fire between them stayed lit, steady and stubborn. It didn't. Roar didn't reach, but it didn't go out either, and neither did he.